Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we are not rushing anywhere at all, because you are about to drift backward through time into a world where nothing resembling pasta exists yet, and yet everything that will eventually become it is already quietly forming in the background of human survival. You are standing in a landscape that feels unfamiliar but strangely intimate, like a memory you have never personally lived but somehow still recognize in your bones. The air is cool, carrying the scent of crushed wild grasses and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance you hear the slow rhythm of early human life, unstructured, uncertain, but already learning patterns. And yes, you probably would not survive it comfortably without all your modern conveniences, but let us keep that between us for now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening from somewhere in the world right now, maybe lying in bed or resting after a long day, leave your location and local time in your mind for a moment, because it helps anchor you into this shared global quiet. And now, dim the lights. Now dim the lights. Flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You are not in Italy. In fact, Italy does not exist yet in any meaningful sense. You're walking through a long stretch of early human development where survival depends entirely on observation, repetition, and patience. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, soft in some places, firm in others, shaped by seasons that feel less predictable than anything you know today. Small groups of humans move through this space with careful attention, scanning plants, seeds, and grains that grow wild rather than being planted. Every step they take is an experiment, even if they do not yet have a word for experimentation. A mainstream historical fact tells us that early human societies began domesticating grains such as wheat and barley in regions often referred to as the Fertile Crescent, a slow transformation that fundamentally changed how humans organized their lives. But here, in this earlier mental landscape, you are still before even that full domestication settles in. You are watching the moment just before stability, when humans are beginning to notice that certain seeds, when gathered and crushed, behave differently from others. They soften, they bind, they feel hunger in a way that raw plants do not quite manage. You kneel near a shallow fire pit, though fire itself is still a cautious companion. The smoke drifts upward in thin streams, stinging your eyes slightly, and the warmth it provides is inconsistent, like a promise not fully kept. Nearby, someone is grinding grains between two stones. The sound is repetitive, almost meditative. A soft scraping rhythm that will eventually become the backbone of countless future cuisines. You can smell the dust of broken grain mixing with the earthy air, forming something that feels almost edible even before it is cooked. A quirky tidbit from archaeological interpretations suggests that some early fermented grain mixtures may have been left to sit unintentionally, creating soft, dough-like substances that were neither bread nor porridge, but something in between. You can imagine someone tasting it cautiously, not knowing they are participating in the earliest accidental steps toward foods that will one day travel across continents. It is not elegant, it is not refined, but it is deeply human in its trial and error nature. You watch as hands press and shape this early mixture. There is no recipe, there is only memory of what worked once before. Someone flattens it into a rough disc, someone else stretches it slightly, noticing how it resists and then yields. These are small discoveries, but they accumulate quietly like sediment, forming layers of future cuisine. The wind passes through the settlement, carrying the smell of smoke, grain, and earth, and everything feels temporary, as if the world itself is still deciding what it will become. Historians still argue whether the earliest grain preparation should be considered bread, porridge, or something entirely distinct from both categories. That uncertainty matters more than it seems, because it reveals how difficult it is to draw boundaries around food history when everything is still in motion. You're standing inside that uncertainty now, where definitions do not exist yet, only gradual transformations. You walk further, following the sound of grinding stones. The landscape opens slightly, revealing more clusters of early human activity. Each group is experimenting in slightly different ways. Some roast grains directly, others soak them in water until they soften. Others crush them into paste-like substances that cling together in unexpected forms. There is no shared culinary identity yet, only shared necessity. And yet, beneath all of this improvisation, something important is happening. Humans are learning that food can be changed deliberately, not just consumed as found in nature, but transformed. This realization will eventually lead to everything from bread to noodles to pasta. But here it is still fragile, still experimental, still dependent on chance and repetition. You sit beside one of these groups for a moment. No one speaks in any language you would recognize. But communication is not absent. It exists in gestures, in shared glances toward the fire, in the passing of stone tools from one hand to another. Someone offers you a small portion of the grain mixture. It is warm, dense, slightly rough on the tongue. It is not pleasant in any modern sense. But it is sustaining, and in this moment, sustenance is everything. The night begins to settle, and the fire becomes more important than the food. Shadows stretch across the ground, and the world feels smaller, contained within the circle of light. You can hear distant movement beyond the settlement, but it does not feel threatening. It feels like part of a larger rhythm that you are only beginning to understand. And as you remain here, you start to notice something subtle. The repetition of grinding, mixing, shaping, and heating is not random anymore. It's becoming structured. It is becoming learned behavior. Each attempt improves slightly on the last. Each failure teaches something that will not be forgotten. You are witnessing the very earliest stage of a food that does not yet exist, but is already being shaped by human hands without intention or design. It is quiet work, almost invisible in its importance, but it will travel far beyond this moment, far beyond this landscape, far beyond anything these early humans could ever imagine. And now, as the fire continues to burn low and steady, you feel the weight of the day settle into stillness. The grains have been ground, the mixtures prepared, the first fragile steps taken without anyone realizing their historical significance. Everything is simple here, but nothing is insignificant. The fire from the previous night has not fully disappeared in your mind. Even now, as you move forward through time, you can still feel its warmth clinging faintly to your perception, like an echo that refuses to fade completely. But the landscape has already shifted. The air is slightly drier, the terrain more structured, and human presence feels less scattered. You are no longer in the earliest experimental phase of grain preparation. You're entering a world where repetition is beginning to shape survival into something more predictable. A mainstream historical fact reminds us that in regions such as the Fertile Crescent, early agricultural communities began deliberately cultivating wheat and barley, moving from foraging towards structured farming systems that stabilized food supply. In this moment, you are standing right at the edge of that transformation. Wild grasses are still present, but they are no longer random gifts of nature. Humans are beginning to recognize cycles. They are beginning to return to the same patches of land, season after season, noticing which areas yield more consistent harvests. You walk through a settlement that feels slightly more permanent than before. The structures are still simple, made from wood, clay, and woven plant fibers, but they no longer feel entirely temporary. There is a sense of planning embedded in their layout. Paths between shelters are more defined, storage areas are becoming intentional, and most importantly, grain is no longer something gathered moment by moment. It is being stored. A quirky tidbit from early archaeological interpretations suggests that some ancient storage pits may have been accidentally sealed in ways that preserved grain longer than expected, leading communities to recognize the value of controlled storage. You imagine someone uncovering a cache of perfectly preserved grain and realizing, perhaps with surprise, that time itself could be managed through technique. That realization alone changes everything about how food is treated. You crouch near one of these storage areas. The air is cooler here, slightly earthy, with a faint scent of dryness that signals preservation. Grain is packed carefully into woven containers and buried shallowly to protect it from moisture and pests. There is care in every motion. Nothing is rushed. Each handful is measured not by precision tools, but by memory and necessity. You begin to understand that food is no longer only immediate survival, it is becoming anticipation. Historians still argue whether the shift toward agriculture was driven more by environmental pressure or by human innovation. But what is clear in this moment is that both forces are present. The land is changing, and humans are changing with it. You can feel that tension in every action around you. Some people still gather wild resources, while others tend early cultivated plots. Two systems exist side by side, overlapping like layers of the same evolving story. You move toward the cultivated fields. They are not fields in the modern sense yet, but they are no longer untouched wilderness either. The ground has been deliberately cleared. Certain plants are encouraged to grow while others are removed. This is not control in the modern industrial sense. It is negotiation with nature. A careful balancing act between what humans want and what the land allows. The wind moves across the open space, carrying dust and pollen. You notice how people observe the plants with increasing attention. They do not just harvest. They watch. They remember. They compare seasons. A slight change in grain size, a difference in stalk strength, a variation in yield becomes meaningful information. Knowledge is no longer accidental, it is accumulating. You sit beside a small group as they grind harvested grain. The stones are worn smoother now, shaped by constant use. The motion is more practiced, more efficient. The sound is rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a pulse that belongs to the community itself. The grain transforms under pressure into a fine, soft substance that clings together in ways that feel increasingly intentional. A mainstream historical fact notes that early grinding tools, such as quernstones, became essential technologies in agricultural societies, fundamentally changing how food was processed and consumed. But here, in this lived moment, the importance of the tool is not theoretical. It is physical, it is audible, it is in your hands, in the vibration of stone against stone, in the dust that rises and settles with each movement. Someone nearby adds water to the ground grain. The mixture changes immediately. It becomes pliable, heavier, more cohesive. It is no longer just crushed seed. It is something new forming in real time. Hands press it, fold it, stretch it slightly. The transformation is subtle, but unmistakable. You're watching the earliest shaping of dough-like material, not yet named, not yet standardized, but already recognized as useful. A quirky tidbit from experimental archaeology suggests that early dough mixtures may have been accidentally overworked or undercooked, producing dense, chewy textures that were nonetheless highly valued for their durability during travel. You imagine someone carrying these early forms of food on long journeys, discovering that endurance matters more than taste in certain circumstances. You feel the rhythm of the settlement around you. People are not just surviving day to day anymore, they are planning forward. There is talk of seasons, of storage capacity, of future harvests. The concept of later is becoming real in a way it was not before. And with it, food takes on a new identity. It is no longer only about immediate hunger, it is about continuity. You walk further, observing how different groups experiment with preparation. Some flatten the dough-like mixture into thin layers and place it near heat sources. Others shape it into thicker forms. There is no consensus yet, but there is curiosity. Each variation is a hypothesis. Each result is a lesson. Slowly, unintentionally, culinary knowledge is being built. Historians still argue whether early bread-like foods emerged independently in multiple regions or spread from a single origin point. But standing here, you can feel how natural multiple origins would be. Human need is universal. The response to grain is almost inevitable when certain conditions align. The sun begins to lower slightly, casting longer shadows across the cultivated fields. The settlement feels more structured than before, but still deeply vulnerable to environmental shifts. A single failed harvest could still undo years of progress. That fragility keeps everything grounded. Nothing here is taken for granted. As evening approaches, you return toward the central fire area. The grain is being prepared again. The same motions repeat, but now with more confidence. There is less hesitation in the hands that mix and shape the dough-like substance. What once was experimental is becoming routine, and in that routine, something profound is forming, not just food, but culture, not just survival, but memory. Each repetition strengthens a shared understanding that will eventually stretch across continents and centuries, transforming into countless variations of what you will one day recognize as pasta. The fire flickers softly as night settles in, the air cools again, and the settlement becomes quieter, more reflective. You remain here for a moment longer, watching the rhythm of preparation continue under dim light. Everything feels slow, deliberate, and deeply human. And as you drift with this moment, you realize that nothing in this world is fixed yet. Everything is still becoming. You move forward again, and the world shifts in a way that feels almost imperceptible at first. The settlements are no longer just places of survival or experimentation. They are beginning to feel like systems that remember themselves. You notice it in the repetition of movement, in the way tools are placed in similar positions, in the way people expect certain processes to unfold without needing to negotiate them every time. Nothing is formalized yet, but structure is quietly emerging underneath daily life. A mainstream historical fact tells us that early agricultural societies in the Fertile Crescent gradually transitioned from opportunistic harvesting of wild grains to intentional cultivation, creating early forms of organized food production that stabilize population growth. In this moment, you're not just observing that shift, you're inside it. The land around you is no longer purely wild. It's partially shaped by human expectation, even if the earth itself has not fully submitted to that expectation. You walk through a landscape where fields are becoming more legible. Boundaries are not marked with precision, but they are understood. Certain patches are tended more carefully, others are left fallow. There is a sense of negotiation between human effort and natural rhythm. You can feel how fragile this balance is, as if a single season of bad weather could erase everything that is being slowly built. A quirky tidbit from early archaeological interpretation suggests some ancient communities may have unintentionally selected for more resilient grain varieties simply by repeatedly harvesting the most productive plants year after year. There is no deliberate genetic planning here, no scientific intention, and yet, evolution is quietly being guided by human preference. You can almost feel that invisible pressure shaping the future of food. You crouch near a working area where grain is being processed. The sound of grinding stones is now deeply familiar, almost comforting. It is no longer a novel discovery. It is routine labor embedded into daily rhythm. The grain is softer now after repeated refinement, and the mixture created from it behaves with more predictability. When water is added, it binds more evenly when pressed. It holds shape longer. These are small improvements, but they accumulate like sediment over time. Historians still argue whether early culinary developments were driven primarily by necessity or by experimentation. But standing here, you notice how the two forces cannot really be separated. Hunger pushes innovation forward, but curiosity refines it. Someone always tries something slightly different, even when survival does not demand it. You observe a group preparing dough-like material with more intention than before. The motions are no longer hesitant. Hands move with a rhythm that suggests familiarity. The mixture is kneaded, folded, and stretched in repeated cycles. There is a tactile understanding developing here, a sense of when the texture feels right, even without measurement. It is knowledge stored in muscle rather than language. Nearby, heat sources glow faintly. Flat surfaces of heated stone or clay are used to transform the dough into something more durable. The process is not standardized, but it is becoming recognizable. Thin forms cook quickly. Thicker forms retain moisture longer. Each variation produces a different result, and those results are remembered, not written, but shared through repetition and observation. You sit beside one of the workers for a moment. Their hands are dusted with grain residue, and their movements are steady. There is no rush. Time here is shaped by cycles rather than clocks. The rhythm of preparation is aligned with the rhythm of hunger, rest, and return. You begin to understand how deeply this slow structure of life will eventually influence everything that comes after. A mainstream historical fact notes that early communities often developed food preparation techniques that maximize both storage and portability, especially as seasonal variability forced groups to adapt to changing resource availability. You can see that logic forming here in real time. Food is no longer just eaten where it is produced. It is being shaped for travel, for delay, for future need. You notice a small detail that feels almost insignificant at first. Some of the dough-like strands are being stretched thinner than others, forming elongated shapes that hang briefly before being laid down to dry or cook. There is no special name for this process yet, no category, but the physical behavior of the material is being explored carefully. Stretch, resistance, return. Each property is being tested through human touch. A quirky tidbit from experimental food history suggests that elongated dough forms may have emerged independently in different regions simply because hands naturally pull and extend materials when trying to portion them. What seems like innovation may sometimes be simple ergonomics. You imagine countless unnamed individuals discovering the same motion, unaware that they are converging on a future global food structure. The settlement around you is now more active in a coordinated sense. Tasks are divided informally. Some people focus on grain collection, others on grinding, others on preparation and cooking. There is no hierarchy in a formal sense. But there is specialization emerging. People become known for certain skills. This quiet differentiation strengthens the system without anyone explicitly designing it. You walk toward the edge of the cultivated area. The fields extend outward in uneven patterns, shaped by both environment and human intervention. You can see traces of experimentation everywhere. Some areas show more vigorous growth, others appear exhausted. The land is being learned, not mastered. That distinction matters. It defines the entire relationship between humans and food at this stage. Historians still argue whether early agricultural expansion was more cooperative with ecosystems or gradually exploitative. But here the answer feels ambiguous. The land is not being dominated in an industrial sense. It is being engaged with. Repeatedly, sometimes gently, sometimes carelessly, always adaptively. As the sun shifts overhead, the color of everything changes slightly. Shadows lengthen. The air cools, activity slows but does not stop. Food preparation continues because it must. The rhythm of survival does not align with comfort, it aligns with necessity. You return again to the central area where grain is processed. The same tools, the same stones, the same motions, but something subtle has changed. The consistency of the mixture is now more reliable. The outcomes are less random. This reliability is the true beginning of culinary history. Not invention, but repeatability. Someone offers you a portion again, you take it. The texture is familiar now, less strange than before. Still simple, still rough by future standards, but undeniably more structured than anything from earlier moments. You notice how quickly familiarity forms when repetition increases. What once felt experimental now feels normal. The fire begins to glow more strongly as evening returns. Conversations soften, movements slow, the settlement transitions into a quieter phase of the day. Yet even in this quiet, preparation continues in small ways. Grain is stored, dough is shaped, tools are cleaned and placed carefully. Nothing is wasted. Everything is prepared for the next cycle. And as you sit near the edge of this rhythm, you begin to sense something larger forming beneath it. Not just food, not just technique, but continuity. A pattern that will survive far beyond any single group, any single generation. Something that will eventually travel across seas, languages, and empires without ever losing its essential structure. The world around you is still simple in appearance, but underneath that simplicity, complexity is quietly building. And you are watching it happen one repeated motion at a time. You drift forward again, and the landscape subtly reshapes itself into something more interconnected. The sense of isolated experimental groups begins to fade. Instead, you're entering a world where knowledge moves between people more fluidly, carried not by writing or formal systems, but by observation, imitation, and travel. Small innovations no longer stay local for long, they spread, slowly but steadily, like sparks carried by wind. A well-established line of archaeological interpretation suggests that early food practices involving grains began to diversify across different regions as communities adapted similar raw materials into distinct culinary traditions. You feel that diversity forming around you now, the same basic substance, crushed grain mixed with water, begins to appear in multiple forms depending on who is preparing it and where. You follow a narrow path between settlements. It's not engineered in any modern sense, but it is repeatedly used, and that repetition gives it shape. Along this route, you notice small differences in preparation styles. One group favours thicker, denser dough structures that hold heat longer. Another prefers thinner forms that cook quickly over open flame. These differences are not ideological. They are practical adaptations to environment and lifestyle. A lesser-known anthropological observation points out that some early culinary variations may have emerged simply because of differences in hand strength, water availability, or local climate conditions rather than deliberate innovation. You begin to see how deeply human physiology itself is embedded in the evolution of food. Even something as simple as how long someone kneads dough can change its future. You pause near a communal preparation area. The smell here is stronger, richer, slightly more complex than before. Grain dust mixes with heated surfaces and faint tamuk, creating an atmosphere that feels almost edible even before tasting. The work is ongoing, rhythmic, and shared. There is no separation between cooking and daily life. They are the same process unfolding continuously. You notice a subtle but important shift. Some dough preparations are no longer being consumed immediately. Instead, they are being set aside, exposed to air, or placed near controlled heat sources. This introduces a new idea into human behaviour. Not all food must be eaten at once. Some of it can be transformed and preserved. Historians continue to debate whether early preservation techniques emerged from intentional planning or accidental discovery during periods of scarcity. Standing here, you can sense both possibilities existing at once. Someone may have forgotten a piece of prepared dough. Someone else may have deliberately left it to test what would happen. Either way, the result is the same. Food becomes something that can endure time. You move deeper into the settlement and observe more structured behaviour around preparation tools. Stones used for grinding are no longer shared randomly. Certain tools appear to belong to specific households or groups. This subtle ownership creates continuity. The same surfaces shape the same grains day after day, producing consistency in texture and quality. A relatively overlooked ethnographic detail suggests that repeated use of the same grinding surfaces may have influenced flavour consistency in early grain-based foods. Even before people understood the concept of flavour in analytical terms, you can almost feel that continuity in the rhythm of production. The past is literally embedded in the tools. You sit briefly near a preparation site. The dough here is being stretched more deliberately now, not just pressed or flattened. There is a tactile curiosity in the movement. Hands pull and extend the material, watching how it responds. It resists slightly, then yields. This interaction is becoming familiar across groups, even if no shared terminology exists yet. You notice that some of the stretched forms are being arranged in parallel lines. Others are coiled loosely. None of this has standardized meaning, yet patterns are forming through repetition. What begins as experimentation slowly becomes recognizable structure. A well-documented historical transition in early culinary anthropology highlights that many staple food forms likely emerge from repeated physical manipulation of dough, rather than from single moments of invention. You can feel that truth in the environment around you. Nothing here is invented in isolation. Everything is refined through repetition. As you move through the settlement, you notice children observing more than participating. They watch the adults grind, mix, stretch, and heat grain-based mixtures. Learning here is not formal. It is absorbed through proximity. Knowledge is atmospheric, carried in motion rather than instruction. You pass by a small fire area where thin strands of dough-like material are being exposed to heat in a controlled way. The transformation is subtle but visible. The surface firms slightly while the interior remains soft. This contrast in texture seems to be noticed immediately by those preparing it. It changes how the food is handled and stored. A lesser-known archaeological insight suggests that early communities may have valued durability in food as much as taste, especially in environments where uncertainty in food supply was common. You understand this instinctively as you watch portions being prepared for later consumption rather than immediate eating. The sun begins to shift again, lowering slightly, and the settlement transitions into a slower rhythm. Work continues, but with less intensity. Conversations become shorter, movements become more deliberate. There is a sense that the day is not ending abruptly but tapering off gradually, like a process winding down rather than stopping. You return once more to the central preparation space. The same motions continue, but they feel more refined than before. The dough is smoother, more consistent. The shapes being formed are more deliberate. There is less uncertainty in the hands that work it. This is no longer experimental behavior. It is practiced craft. Historians still disagree on whether early food refinement processes should be viewed as technological progress or cultural adaptation. But here the distinction feels irrelevant. What matters is that the process is becoming stable. Stability is the foundation of everything that follows. As evening settles fully, the firelight grows warmer against the cooling air. The settlement enters its quiet phase again. But you notice that food preparation does not entirely stop, it simply changes pace. Some items are left to rest, others are prepared for the next cycle. Storage and anticipation now coexist with immediate consumption. And in this balance between now and later, you begin to sense the slow emergence of something far larger than any single community. A shared human relationship with grain that will eventually evolve into countless forms across continents and centuries, eventually becoming what you recognize today as pasta, for now. Though, it is still only motion, repetition, and discovery, unfolding gently in the rhythm of years daily. You move forward again, and something changes in the atmosphere that is difficult to name at first. It is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual tightening of connection between distant places. The world feels slightly more networked, as if separate communities are beginning to sense each other's existence even without direct contact. Ideas, especially practical ones like food preparation, no longer stay contained. They begin to drift outward through movement, trade, and human curiosity. A widely accepted archaeological synthesis indicates that early agricultural societies did not develop in isolation, but instead formed overlapping zones of exchange where grains, tools, and preparation techniques gradually circulated between communities. You can feel that overlap now. The dough you have been observing is no longer just a local experiment. It is part of a broader human conversation. You walk along a travel route that is becoming more frequently used. It is still uneven, shaped by foot traffic rather than design, but it connects multiple settlements in a way that feels increasingly intentional. Along this path, you encounter small exchanges of goods, grain changes hands, tools are shared or traded, and with each interaction, subtle variations in food preparation travel with them. A lesser-known ethnographic observation suggests that even minor differences in milling technique or water quality can significantly alter the texture of grain-based mixtures, leading to regional variation in early dough foods without any deliberate cultural planning. You begin to understand how diversity in food might arise naturally, almost accidentally, from environmental differences alone. You stop briefly near a small gathering site along the route. People here are preparing grain in a way that feels slightly different from what you have seen before. The mixture is finer, more uniform. The grinding stones appear more worn, suggesting long-term use and refinement. The resulting dough is smoother, more elastic, responding differently under pressure. It stretches further before breaking, a property that clearly matters to those handling it. A mainstream historical fact points out that improvements in grinding technology, such as more efficient stone tools, played a crucial role in expanding the possibilities of grain-based foods in early societies. You can see that progression physically expressed here. The tool is not just an object, it is a shaping force for culinary evolution. You crouch beside a worker who is pulling the dough into elongated strands. The motion is deliberate, almost rhythmic. The material resists slightly, then extends. It does not tear easily. That resistance seems to be part of the appeal. The shape is held briefly in the air before being laid down carefully. There is no name for this form yet, but it is distinct enough to be recognized consistently. A quirky historical tidbit from experimental archaeology suggests that elongated dough forms may have initially emerged as a byproduct of portioning techniques rather than intentional shaping, later becoming standardized only after people recognized their usefulness in cooking and drying. You imagine how many such accidents must have shaped human cuisine without ever being recorded. You continue along the route and notice how food preparation begins to reflect not just local needs, but shared knowledge. Techniques appear echoed across different groups, not identical but recognizably related. This is how tradition begins to form, not through formal instruction, but through repetition across distance. Historians still argue whether early culinary convergence was driven more by migration or by independent innovation under similar environmental pressures, but what you see here suggests both forces working simultaneously. Humans adapt in similar ways when faced with similar problems, even without direct contact. You enter a slightly larger settlement. The scale of activity is noticeably broader. More people are involved in grain processing, and the organization feels subtly more complex. There are designated areas for grinding, mixing, and heating. These divisions are not rigid, but they are consistent enough to suggest emerging structure. You observe that storage has become more important here. Grain is kept in larger quantities, protected from moisture and pests. The presence of stored surplus changes everything. It creates time. It allows planning beyond immediate consumption. And with that shift, food becomes something that can be shaped not only by hunger, but by expectation. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that surplus storage often leads to increased experimentation in food preparation. As communities are no longer constrained by immediate scarcity, you can see that effect clearly in the variety of dough preparations around you. Some are simple and utilitarian, others are more refined, shaped with care and variation. You sit near a group working the dough with practiced hands. The material has reached a consistency that feels almost familiar now. It stretches, folds, and holds shape in predictable ways. The rhythm of preparation is steady, almost meditative. You notice how little verbal communication is needed. Most coordination happens through observation and timing. A mainstream historical observation notes that early food processing activities often became central to social organization, not just survival, as shared labor created structured daily rhythms within communities. You can feel that structure forming here. The preparation of grain is not just a task, it is a social anchor. Nearby, you notice a controlled heat source being used to alter the dough further. The transformation is subtle but important. The exterior firms slightly while the interior remains soft. This creates a contrast in texture that seems to be recognized immediately as desirable. Portions are adjusted accordingly. Some are left thinner for faster transformation, others are thicker for durability. A quirky tidbit from food history research suggests that early variations in cooking methods may have been influenced as much by available heating surfaces as by culinary intention. With flat stones, embers, and clay surfaces all producing distinct results, you begin to see how technology and environment quietly shape taste. The settlement grows quieter as the day progresses. Activity slows, but does not stop. Food preparation continues in smaller cycles. Some portions are consumed immediately, others are set aside for later. The idea of delay, of future consumption, is now deeply embedded in daily behavior. You walk through the edge of the settlement, where the cultivated land meets wilder terrain. The boundary is not sharp, it is gradual, overlapping. Here, human influence fades slowly into natural growth. Yet even in this transitional space, grain plants appear more abundant than before, suggesting that human activity has begun to influence the landscape itself. Historians still debate whether early agricultural expansion should be understood as environmental management or as the beginning of ecological transformation driven by human preference. Standing here, the answer feels layered rather than singular. It is both shaping and being shaped. As evening returns, you find yourself once again near a central fire area. The familiar rhythm of grain processing resumes. Grinding, mixing, shaping, heating. Each motion feels slightly more refined than before, as if accumulated experience is gradually reducing uncertainty. You take a small portion again. The texture is different now, more consistent, more structured. Not modern, not refined, but clearly evolving. You notice how quickly familiarity develops when repetition becomes constant. What once felt like experimentation now feels like emerging tradition. The fire burns steadily as night settles over the settlement. Conversations fade into softer tones. The world becomes quieter, but not still. Food preparation continues in the background, linking one day to the next, one generation to the next, without interruption. And in this continuity, you begin to sense the slow formation of something far larger than any single community could recognize. A shared trajectory of grain, shaping, and transformation that will eventually travel across continents, evolve through cultures, and become part of everyday life in ways no one here could ever imagine. For now, it is simply rhythm, repetition, and the patient shaping of possibility, you move forward again, and the world begins to feel less like scattered settlements and more like a living continuum of exchange. The distances between communities are still real, still demanding effort and time, but they no longer feel absolute. What one group learns about grain, another group will eventually encounter, not immediately, not evenly, but inevitably. Knowledge is starting to behave like something that moves. A widely recognized archaeological interpretation suggests that early river valley civilizations developed increasingly complex grain processing systems as agriculture intensified and surplus production became more common. You're now inside that slow intensification. The grain is no longer just a seasonal resource. It is becoming the center of daily structure, shaping when people wake, work, and rest. You follow a path that leads toward a larger gathering area, one that feels more active than earlier settlements. Smoke rises in multiple columns. The soundscape is denser. Grinding stones, voices, footsteps, and the faint crackle of heat sources overlap into a continuous background rhythm. It is not chaotic. It is coordinated in a loose, organic way that emerges naturally from repetition. A lesser-known anthropological observation suggests that as grain processing becomes more central to survival, societies tend to develop specialized spaces dedicated entirely to food preparation. Even before formal architecture appears, you can see this happening here. Certain areas are clearly reserved for grinding, others for mixing, others for heating. These divisions are not enforced by authority. They are reinforced by habit. You kneel near one of these preparation zones. The grain here is being processed more finely than before. The texture of the flour-like substance is softer, more consistent, and easier to work with. Water is added in controlled amounts, not randomly, but with a sense of practiced judgment. The mixture responds more predictably now. It stretches without immediately breaking, holds together longer, and behaves almost like a living material under human touch. A mainstream historical fact notes that improvements in grinding tools and techniques significantly increased the efficiency of grain-based diets in early agricultural societies, allowing populations to grow and settlements to stabilize. You can feel that efficiency not as a number, but as a physical sensation in the ease of preparation around you. Less effort produces more usable food. That simple shift changes everything. You observe a group working with elongated strands of dough-like material. The motion is now highly familiar across multiple communities. The dough is pulled, extended, and laid down in repeated cycles. There is no hesitation in the movement. It has become muscle memory passed between generations. The strands are more uniform now, suggesting increasing consistency and technique. A quirky historical tidbit from food anthropology suggests that early elongated grain preparations may have been influenced by drying practices, where stretching dough increased surface area and improved preservation in certain climates. You imagine how a simple environmental challenge, like humidity or heat, could silently shape the future of an entire category of food. You move deeper into the settlement. Here, storage structures are more prominent. Grain is kept in larger, more carefully maintained spaces. These are not yet sophisticated granaries in a later historical sense, but they show clear intentionality, elevation, dryness, and protection from animals are all being considered. The idea of safeguarding future food is now fully integrated into community behavior. Historians still argue whether the emergence of large-scale grain storage was primarily a response to environmental instability or a catalyst for social hierarchy. Standing here, you can feel both interpretations existing at once. Surplus creates stability, but also creates dependence, coordination, and subtle forms of control. You watch as grain is brought from storage and processed in steady cycles. The repetition is striking, not identical repetition, but structured variation. Each group adapts slightly, but the core process remains recognizable. Grind, mix, shape, heat. These 4 actions are becoming foundational, almost ritualistic in their regularity. You sit near a preparation surface where heat is being applied in a controlled way. The dough-like material transforms gradually. The exterior firms, the interior remains soft, and a faint aroma begins to rise that feels more developed than earlier stages. It is still simple, but it is no longer raw in the same sense. Transformation has become part of expectation. A lesser-known scholarly insight suggests that early cooking surfaces may have been reused continuously over long periods, allowing residual heat and residue to subtly influence flavor development in grain-based foods. You can almost sense that accumulated history in the surface itself, as if each previous preparation leaves a trace that affects the next. You notice that preparation is now less individual and more collective. Groups coordinate without formal instruction. One person grinds while another prepares water, another shapes dough while another manages heat. These roles shift fluidly, but the overall structure remains stable. Coordination is becoming instinctive. A mainstream historical observation highlights that the development of shared food preparation routines played a significant role in strengthening early community cohesion. As daily survival tasks required cooperation and timing, you feel that cohesion not as an abstract idea, but as a rhythm in the environment. People move in relation to each other with increasing ease. You walk toward the edge of the cultivated zone again. The fields here are more extensive than before. Grain plants stretch further into the distance, forming patterns that feel less wild and more guided. There is still unpredictability in growth, but human influence is becoming more visible. Selection, clearing, and replanting are gradually reshaping the land. A quirky tidbit from agricultural history suggests that early farmers may have initially misinterpreted plant growth cycles, believing certain patterns were seasonal coincidences before recognizing consistent agricultural relationships. You can imagine the moment when coincidence becomes understanding. When observation turns into expectation, the sun shifts lower in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the settlement. Activity slows but does not cease. Food preparation continues in smaller, more deliberate cycles. Some dough is prepared for immediate use, while other portions are set aside carefully for later transformation or consumption. You return once again to the central fire area. The familiarity here is now undeniable. The same motions, the same tools, the same basic sequence. Yet nothing is static. Everything is slightly more refined than before. The dough behaves more predictably, the shaping is more consistent, the outcomes are less variable. Historians still debate whether culinary refinement should be seen as technological progress or cultural adaptation to environmental constraints. But here, the distinction feels less important than the result itself. What matters is stability. What matters is reliability. What matters is that food can now be produced with growing confidence. You take a portion again. The texture is noticeably more structured than in earlier sections of this journey. It is still far from modern cuisine, but it carries a sense of continuity that was absent before. It feels like something that could be repeated tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, without losing its identity. The fire burns steadily as night returns. The settlement quiets into its familiar rhythm. Conversations soften, movement slow, and preparation becomes minimal but continuous. Storage, shaping, and planning all coexist within the same space now. And as you remain here, you begin to understand that nothing in this world is isolated anymore. Every action connects to another. Every preparation points toward a future moment. Grain is no longer just food. It is structure. It is memory. It is anticipation. And in this slow, steady continuity, you are watching the early architecture of a global food history take shape, one repeated motion at a time. You move forwards again, and the landscape begins to feel less like isolated pockets of human survival and more like a widening cultural field. Not in the sense of borders or nations, but in the sense of shared habits slowly becoming recognizable across distance. Grain is still the central thread, but now you can see how different groups are beginning to handle the same material in increasingly varied, yet related ways. A well-established strand of archaeological understanding points out that early river valley societies did not simply adopt agriculture at once, but gradually refined it through centuries of trial, error, and environmental adjustment. You are now deep inside that refinement process. Nothing here is sudden. Everything is accumulated. You enter a settlement that feels more stable than earlier ones. The structures are firmer, more consistently arranged, and there is a noticeable sense of permanence in how space is used. Paths are not just worn by movement anymore. They are intentionally maintained. Certain areas are clearly designated for grain processing, others for storage, others for gathering. For this is not formal urban planning, but it is no longer randomness either. A lesser-known archaeological interpretation suggests that spatial organization in early settlements often emerged directly from repeated daily actions rather than from centralized design, with human movement itself gradually carving out functional zones. You can see that process unfolding under your feet. The ground remembers repetition. You stop near a central preparation area. The sound of grinding is now deeply embedded in the environment, no longer noticeable as separate events but as a continuous background rhythm. Grain is being processed in larger quantities here, suggesting both surplus and demand. The material is finer than before, more uniform, responding to water with greater consistency. A widely recognized historical observation highlights that improvements in milling technology played a crucial role in transforming grain from a coarse survival food into a flexible culinary base that could be shaped in multiple forms. You can feel that transformation physically. The grain no longer resists human manipulation in the same way. It cooperates more readily. You watch as dough is prepared in repeated cycles. The motions are efficient now, almost economical. Water is added with measured judgment. The mixture is kneaded until it reaches a familiar elasticity. It no longer feels experimental. It feels learned. Hands move with confidence, adjusting instinctively rather than hesitantly. A subtle ethnographic insight suggests that in many early societies, tactile knowledge often replaced formal instruction, with food preparation skills transmitted through observation and repetition rather than structured teaching. You see that clearly here. There is no instruction being given. There is only watching and doing. Nearby, elongated strands of dough are being formed again, but with greater consistency than before. The shapes are more uniform, suggesting that techniques are stabilizing across individuals. The stretching motion is smooth, almost rhythmic, as if the material and the hands have reached a shared understanding. A lesser-known culinary history note suggests that repeated stretching and shaping of grain dough may have unintentionally influenced protein structure, improving elasticity over time and encouraging further refinement of technique. You imagine this feedback loop between human touch and material behavior quietly shaping the future of food. You move through the settlement and notice that food preparation is now deeply integrated into daily rhythm. It is not a separate activity anymore. It is part of life's structure. Morning, preparation, midday, adjustment, evening, continuation. Grain processing is no longer a task, it is a cycle. You pass storage areas that are larger and more carefully maintained than before. Grain is protected from moisture, animals, and decay with increasing attention. The idea of preserving surplus is now fully embedded in behavior. This changes everything about planning. The future is now something that can be prepared for physically. A mainstream archaeological understanding notes that the ability to store grain reliably was one of the key foundations for the development of more complex societies. as it allowed communities to survive beyond immediate harvest cycles. You can feel that shift in the air here. Time itself feels longer. You sit beside a group working the dough mixture again. The texture is noticeably smoother than in earlier stages of this journey. It stretches further without breaking, forming continuous strands that are carefully laid down in organized patterns. There is a sense of satisfaction in the motion, as if the material is finally behaving as expected. A quirky historical observation suggests that early food improvements often emerged not from invention, but from repeated correction of small inconsistencies, gradually eliminating failures until stable methods remained. You're witnessing that refinement process in real time. Nothing dramatic, just continuous adjustment. You notice that heat application has become more controlled, instead of direct exposure to open flame alone. There are now intermediate surfaces used to regulate transformation. Stone, clay, and embers are arranged in ways that create predictable outcomes. The same dough can now produce different textures depending on how it is treated. A widely accepted line of food history research suggests that early thermal techniques were among the first forms of material control developed by human societies, long before metallurgy or construction reached advanced stages. Here, that control is still simple, but unmistakably intentional. The settlement begins to slow as the day progresses. Activity becomes more distributed and less intense. Some groups focus on immediate preparation, others on storage or maintenance. The system is not rigid, but it is coordinated through habit. Everyone understands the general rhythm without needing explicit direction. You walk toward the edge of the cultivated fields again. The landscape here feels increasingly shaped, though still not fully dominated. Plants grow in clusters that suggest repeated human influence. Selection is happening, even if unconsciously. Certain grains are favoured, others gradually disappear. A lesser-known agricultural insight suggests that early domestication processes often occurred through unconscious human preference rather than deliberate selection, with repeated harvesting shaping plant populations over long periods. You can feel that slow pressure acting on the land itself. The sun lowers, and the settlement transitions into evening rhythm. Fires are lit. Preparation continues in reduced intensity. Dough is shaped, stored, or cooked, depending on need. The atmosphere becomes calmer, more reflective. You return to the central fire area once more. The familiar sequence continues. Grind, mix, shape, heat, but now there is a quiet confidence in every action. The uncertainty of earlier stages has largely disappeared. What remains is refinement. A mainstream historical perspective emphasizes that once food systems reach a certain level of stability, they begin to influence not only survival but also social structure, time perception, and cultural memory. You can sense that influence forming here, quietly but steadily. You take a portion again. The texture feels more cohesive now, more recognizable across repetitions. It is still far from a modern cuisine, but it's no longer experimental. It's becoming tradition in motion. The fire burns into the night, steady and controlled. The settlement settles into rest cycles, but preparation does not fully stop. It simply shifts into maintenance and anticipation. Grain is stored. Dough is prepared for later use. Tools are cleaned and placed with care. And in this continuity, you begin to see something larger emerging. Not just food evolution, but behavioral evolution. A shared rhythm between humans and grain that will eventually spread across continents, adapting endlessly while retaining its core logic of transformation. Everything here is still becoming, and nothing is ever truly separate anymore. You move forward again, and the world subtly changes its tone. It is not louder or quieter, not more crowded or more empty, but more layered. Human presence now feels embedded into the environment in a way that goes beyond simple settlement. It is as if repetition has begun to imprint itself onto the landscape, shaping not only what people do, but how space itself is understood. A well-documented archaeological perspective indicates that as early agricultural communities stabilized, their relationship with grain evolved from opportunistic use to structured dependency, where daily life rhythms increasingly aligned with agricultural cycles. You're now standing inside that alignment. The grain is no longer just a resource, it is a temporal anchor. You enter a settlement that feels noticeably more complex than earlier ones. Movement pathways are more defined, storage areas are more deliberately positioned, and the soundscape is denser with coordinated activity. There is a sense that people here are not simply living together, but operating within an increasingly shared system of timing and labour. A lesser-known anthropological interpretation suggests that the emergence of structured communal spaces in early settlement often preceded formal governance, arising instead from repeated coordination of essential tasks such as food preparation and storage. You can see that logic in action. No one appears to be giving orders, yet everything functions in synchronized rhythm. You approach a central preparation zone where grain processing is occurring at a larger scale. The grinding sounds are steady and layered, not chaotic but continuous, like a collective pulse. The flour-like material being produced is finer and more consistent than in earlier stages of this journey, indicating improved tool use and accumulated technique. A mainstream historical fact highlights that advancements in milling technology significantly increased the efficiency and usability of grain in early societies, allowing food to be processed in forms that were easier to cook, store, and transport. Here, that efficiency is not abstract. It is visible in the reduced effort required to produce usable material and the increased uniformity of the result. You observe dough being prepared with careful attention to consistency. Water is introduced gradually, not all at once. The mixture is worked until it reaches a specific tactile behavior, elastic but stable, soft but not collapsing. Hands move with practiced certainty, adjusting instinctively based on texture rather than instruction. A subtle ethnographic insight suggests that in many early communities, sensory memory played a crucial role in food preparation, with individuals relying on touch, resistance, and texture to guide decisions rather than precise measurement. You can feel that embodied knowledge here, expressed entirely through movement. Nearby, elongated forms of dough are being shaped again, but now with greater uniformity than before. The stretching motion is smoother, and the resulting strands are more consistent in thickness. They are arranged carefully before being exposed to heat or drying conditions. This is no longer experimental variation, it is emerging standardization. A lesser-known culinary anthropology observation proposes that standardization in early food forms often arose unintentionally through repeated imitation of successful outcomes, gradually narrowing variation until dominant techniques became widely adopted. You can see that narrowing happening in real time. Diversity is still present, but it is being filtered by practicality. You move through the settlement and notice how food preparation is increasingly tied to specific areas. These zones are not formally designated, but they are consistently used for the same purposes. Grinding happens in one space, mixing in another, heating in another, over time. Repetition has effectively drawn invisible boundaries across the settlement. A widely recognized historical interpretation notes that spatial specialization in early human settlements often developed organically from task repetition rather than from planned architecture, gradually shaping the earliest forms of organized communal space. You are witnessing that process at a very early stage of complexity. You pause near a heat source where dough is being transformed. The application of heat is more controlled than before, with attention given to distance, duration, and surface type. The resulting change in texture is subtle but important. The exterior firms slightly while the interior remains soft and cohesive, creating a layered structure. A quirky historical tidbit suggests that early variations in heating methods, including placement near embers or on heated stones, may have been discovered accidentally through repeated attempts to preserve or alter dough consistency. You can imagine countless small accidents slowly becoming reliable techniques. You continue toward the outer edge of the settlement, where cultivated land begins. The fields are more expansive now, and the transition between managed and wild terrain is more noticeable. Plants grow in patterns that reflect repeated human intervention. Some areas are clearly favored, others gradually fading from use. A mainstream agricultural observation emphasizes that early cultivation was not uniform, but highly adapted, with communities adjusting planting and harvesting strategies based on seasonal variation and environmental feedback. You can feel that adaptation in the uneven but intentional structure of the fields. The wind moves across the open space carrying faint traces of grain dust and earth. It feels like the entire landscape is now part of the food system in some indirect way. Nothing is fully separate anymore. Even the land itself participates in the rhythm of production and renewal. You return inward toward the settlement as the light begins to soften. Activity continues, but at a slower pace. Some groups are still grinding grain, others are shaping dough for later use, and others are managing storage. The cycle is continuous, but intensity fluctuates throughout the day. A lesser-known historical insight suggests that early agricultural communities often structured their daily rhythms around the processing time of staple foods, with grain preparation acting as an informal clock that regulated collective activity. You can feel that rhythm embedded into every movement here. You sit again near a central preparation space. The familiarity of the process is now unmistakable. Grain is transformed into flour-like substance, mixed with water, kneaded into cohesive dough, shaped into elongated or flattened forms, and then exposed to heat or air. The sequence is stable, repeatable, and widely understood. A mainstream historical fact notes that the stabilization of core food preparation techniques was a critical step in the development of sustained human settlements, allowing populations to grow and remain in place over longer periods of time. Here, that stability feels almost physical, like something you can touch. You take a portion of the prepared food again. The texture is now consistent across multiple cycles. It no longer feels like a discovery each time, it feels like a known outcome. That predictability carries its own quiet comfort. It is not excitement, it is reliability. The firelight grows stronger as the evening settles in. The settlement transitions into its quieter phase, but preparation does not fully stop, it simply shifts into background continuity. Grain is stored, tools are arranged, dough is prepared for future use. Nothing is wasted. Everything is positioned for what comes next. And in this steady repetition, you begin to recognize that something far larger than food is being formed. It is a structure of behavior, a shared logic of transformation that links people across time and distance. Grain is the medium, but continuity is the message. Nothing here is final. Everything is still in motion, and yet the pattern is becoming harder to miss. You move forward again, and the world begins to feel less like a collection of settlements and more like an interconnected web of practices. Nothing is formally unified, yet similarities are becoming too consistent to ignore. Grain is still at the center of everything you see, but now it is no longer just about survival or even routine. It is becoming identity, shaped through repetition and shared necessity across distant communities. A well-established archaeological synthesis suggests that as early agricultural networks expanded, knowledge of grain cultivation and processing techniques spread gradually through migration, exchange, and imitation, creating broad regional continuities in food behavior. You are now moving through one of those continuities. The differences between groups still exist, But the underlying logic is increasingly shared. You enter a settlement that feels more active than previous ones, with a stronger sense of organised motion, not organised by authority in a modern sense, but by rhythm. People move with awareness of each other's timing. Tasks are distributed in a way that reduces friction. Grinding, mixing, shaping, and heating all occur simultaneously in different parts of the space, forming a coordinated whole. A lesser-known anthropological interpretation suggests that early forms of social coordination often emerged from shared subsistence tasks rather than from political structures. With food production acting as the primary framework for collective behaviour, you can feel that framework here. It is not spoken, it is enacted. You kneel near a grinding station where grain is being processed with remarkable consistency. The flour-like material is finer than in earlier stages, indicating improved technique and possibly more refined tools. The repeated motion of grinding stones creates a steady sound that seems to define the atmosphere of the entire settlement. It is repetitive but not monotonous. It is stabilizing. A mainstream historical fact highlights that improvements in early grinding technology played a foundational role in enabling more complex food forms, as finer grain processing allowed for greater flexibility in preparation and cooking methods. You can see that transformation in the texture alone. What once was coarse and uneven is now soft and adaptable. You observe dough being prepared with increased precision. Water is added slowly, and the mixture is worked until it reaches a specific consistency that is clearly understood by those handling it. There is no measuring system, yet the result is remarkably consistent. The knowledge exists in the body rather than in formal instruction. A subtle ethnographic insight suggests that early culinary knowledge was often transmitted through imitation and repetition, with individuals learning correct technique by observing outcomes rather than receiving explicit teaching. You see this reflected in every motion around you. No explanations are needed, only repetition matters. Nearby, elongated dough forms are being produced again, but now with greater uniformity across multiple individuals. The stretching motion is smoother, more confident, and the resulting strands are increasingly consistent in shape and thickness. These forms are being arranged carefully before further transformation, suggesting that their structures become intentionally preserved. A quirky historical observation proposes that many early food shapes may have stabilized not through deliberate design but through repeated success patterns, where certain forms simply proved more practical for cooking, drying, or storage, and were therefore imitated more frequently over time. You can sense that selection happening organically. You move deeper into the settlement, noticing that space is becoming more functionally specialized. Certain areas are consistently used for specific stages of food preparation. Grinding occurs near heavier stone installations. Mixing takes place closer to water sources. Heating is concentrated near stable fire platforms. These patterns are not formally enforced, but they are reinforced through repetition. A widely recognized archaeological interpretation notes that spatial organization in early human settlements often emerged from habitual behavior patterns rather than planned architecture, gradually producing structured environments through repeated daily use. You're walking through one of those emergent structures now. You pause near a heating area where dough is being transformed through controlled exposure to heat. The process is carefully managed. Some pieces are placed closer to heat sources, others further away. The differences in outcome are noticeable. Texture varies depending on position and duration, and these variations are being observed and remembered. A lesser-known culinary anthropology insight suggests that early heating techniques were often discovered incrementally, as communities experimented with different placements and conditions while trying to preserve or improve grain-based foods. You can imagine how many small adjustments accumulated into reliable methods. You continue towards the outer edge of the settlement, where cultivated land becomes visible. The fields are more extensive now, stretching further than in earlier sections of this journey. The boundary between wild and cultivated terrain is still fluid, but increasingly shaped by human activity. Certain plant varieties appear more dominant, suggesting ongoing selection. A mainstream agricultural observation emphasizes that early cultivation systems were dynamic rather than fixed, with continuous feedback between environmental conditions and human preference shaping long-term plant distribution. You can feel that feedback loop in the uneven but purposeful structure of the fields. The wind moves across the landscape, carrying faint traces of grain dust and dry earth. It feels like the entire environment is participating in the food system. Even if indirectly, nothing is fully separate anymore. Land, labour, and nourishment are increasingly interconnected in subtle ways. You return toward the settlement as the light begins to shift. Activity continues but slows slightly. Some groups focus on immediate preparation, others on storage or maintenance. The rhythm remains steady, but intensity decreases as the day transitions toward evening. A lesser-known historical insight suggests that in early agricultural communities, daily cycles were often indirectly structured around food preparation stages, with grain processing acting as a temporal anchor for social activity. You can feel that structure embedded in the flow of movement around you. You sit again near a central preparation area. The sequence is now fully familiar. Grain is ground into flour-like material, mixed with water, kneaded into cohesive dough, shaped into elongated or flattened forms, and exposed to heat or drying. Each step is consistent across time and group variation. A mainstream historical fact notes that the stabilization of food preparation sequences was a key factor in supporting long-term settlement growth, as predictable food systems allowed for more stable population structures and reduced daily uncertainty. Here, that predictability is becoming tangible. You take a portion again. The texture is now reliably consistent. It no longer surprises you, but it also no longer fails you. That reliability carries its own quiet significance. It represents control over uncertainty, even in a limited form. The fire burns steadily as evening settles in. The settlement transitions into a quieter phase, but activity does not fully stop. It becomes maintenance, preparation, and anticipation. Grain is stored, dough is prepared for later use, tools are cleaned and arranged. Everything is positioned for continuation. And in this continuity, you begin to see something larger forming beneath the surface of daily life. Not just a food system, but a shared behavioural structure that connects communities across distance and time. Grain is the medium through which this structure expresses itself, but the deeper pattern is repetition itself. Everything here is still in motion, but the direction of that motion is becoming increasingly clear. You move forward again, and something subtle but important begins to shift in how time itself feels within the world you're observing. It is no longer just a sequence of daily survival cycles. It feels increasingly structured, as if human activity is beginning to impose a kind of rhythm onto nature, rather than simply reacting to it. Grain is still central, but its role has expanded beyond nourishment into something closer to coordination of life itself. Archaeological consensus points toward the idea that early agricultural societies gradually developed shared seasonal awareness, where planting, harvesting, and processing became synchronized across communities through repeated experience rather than formal communication. You're now inside that synchronization. The environment feels less random, more anticipated. You enter a larger settlement area where activity is noticeably denser. Movement is continuous but organized in flowing patterns. People pass each other with practiced efficiency, avoiding collision without needing to pause. The soundscape is layered but coherent, grinding stone against stone. Low conversations, fire cracking, and the soft rustle of grain being handled in bulk. One line of anthropological interpretation suggests that increasing settlement density often led to more efficient division of labour even before formal social hierarchies appeared. simply because repeated tasks naturally clustered into specialized roles. You can see that clustering here. Certain individuals consistently handle grain preparation, others focus on heat management, others on storage and transport. You pause near a central processing area where grain is being transformed at a scale larger than earlier sections. The volume alone suggests surplus production. The flour-like substance being produced is finely textured, almost powdery, and behaves predictably when mixed with water. It binds quickly, forming cohesive dough with minimal effort. Evidence from early material culture studies indicates that refinement of grinding techniques directly influenced the versatility of grain-based foods, enabling communities to experiment with new textures and preparation methods. You feel that refinement in every motion. The material responds easily now, almost as if it has been trained by repeated handling over generations. You observe the preparation of elongated dough forms again, but now the process appears standardized across multiple individuals. The stretching motion is consistent, the thickness more controlled, and the resulting shapes are aligned in similar orientations before being placed aside. This uniformity suggests shared understanding rather than isolated experimentation. One interesting observation from experimental archaeology is that consistency in early food shaping often emerged from imitation of successful outcomes rather than intentional standard setting, gradually narrowing variation as certain methods proved more practical over time. You're watching that narrowing process unfold slowly and naturally. You move through the settlement and notice how storage has become more prominent and more organized. Grain is no longer simply kept in containers. It is categorized, separated, and positioned based on expected use. Some portions are reserved for immediate preparation, others for future cycles, and some are left untouched as long-term reserve. Research into early subsistence systems suggests that surplus storage fundamentally altered human planning behavior, introducing the concept of delayed consumption on a communal scale. You can feel that shift in mindset here. The future is no longer abstract, it is physically stored within reach. You sit beside a preparation station where dough is being kneaded with steady rhythm. The motion is repetitive but not mechanical. It carries a sense of learned precision. The material stretches and folds under pressure, gradually reaching a consistency that is immediately recognizable to those working with it. Ethnographic studies of traditional food systems indicate that tactile memory often replaces formal measurement in early culinary practices, with individuals relying on texture, resistance, and elasticity to determine readiness. You see that embodied knowledge expressed clearly in each adjustment of pressure and timing. Nearby, heat applications being managed with increasing care, instead of simple exposure to flame. There is now deliberate control over distance and duration. Dough forms are placed at varying proximities to heat sources, resulting in different textures and levels of firmness. These differences are intentional and carefully observed. Some interpretations in food history research suggest that controlled heating environments may have emerged gradually from attempts to solve inconsistencies in early cooking results, leading to increasingly refined methods over time. You can sense that refinement embedded in the careful placement of each piece. You continue toward the outer boundary of cultivated land. The fields here are larger and more clearly defined than before, while still irregular by modern standards. They show consistent patterns of use and renewal. Certain grain varieties appear more dominant, suggesting ongoing selection based on performance and yield. Agricultural development studies often highlight that early cultivation systems were shaped by feedback loops between environmental response and human preference, resulting in gradual but persistent changes in plant distribution. You are witnessing that feedback loop expressed in the landscape itself. The wind moves gently across the open fields, carrying faint traces of grain dust and dry soil. It connects the cultivated and uncultivated zones into a single breathable system. The boundary between human influence and natural growth feels increasingly blurred. You return toward the settlement as daylight begins to soften. Activity continues but shifts in intensity. Some groups are still engaged in grain processing, while others focus on organizing storage or preparing materials for later use. The rhythm remains steady, but the pace becomes more relaxed. Studies of early settlement behavior suggest that daily activity cycles often became indirectly structured around food preparation schedules, effectively turning subsistence tasks into temporal markers for communal life. You can feel that structuring effect in the way movement slows and organizes itself naturally. You return once again to the central fire area. The sequence of transformation is now deeply familiar. Grain becomes flour-like material. Flour becomes dough. Dough becomes shaped forms, and shaped forms are exposed to controlled heat. The process is stable, repeatable, and widely understood. Archaeological interpretation emphasizes that once food production reaches this level of stability, it becomes a foundational element of cultural continuity, shaping not only diet but also social rhythm and collective memory. Here, that continuity feels almost tangible. You take a portion again, the texture is consistent, neither surprising nor uncertain. It carries the weight of repetition rather than novelty. What once felt like experimentation now feels like dependable outcome, and that shift quietly defines everything around you. The fire continues to burn into evening. The settlement transitions into a lower energy state, but activity does not cease. It simply changes form. Storage is checked, tools are arranged, and dough is prepared for later cycles. The system remains in motion even as rest begins. And within that ongoing motion, you begin to perceive something larger forming beneath it all. Not a single invention, not a single moment of discovery, but a long accumulation of repeated human behavior gradually shaping the foundation of a global food lineage. Grain is still just grain here, but everything it touches is slowly becoming structure. You move forward again, and the sense of time begins to feel less like a straight line and more like a layered accumulation. Each settlement you have passed no longer feels separate in your memory. Instead, they begin to overlap, as if countless small variations of the same daily ritual are happening simultaneously across a wide landscape. Grain, in all its forms, remains the quiet center of this expanding pattern. Scholarly consensus in early agricultural studies often describes this phase of human development as a period of intensification, where existing food practices were not radically reinvented, but gradually optimized through repetition, exchange, and environmental adaptation. You are now deep inside that intensification. Nothing feels newly invented anymore. Everything feels refined through use. You enter a settlement that feels more grounded than earlier ones, with structures that appear more durable and intentionally maintained. Walls are thicker, storage areas are more protected, and movement pathways are more clearly established. The settlement does not feel built all at once. It feels grown, like something shaped slowly by repeated necessity. One line of archaeological interpretation suggests that increasing permanence in early settlements often emerged directly from the need to protect stored food resources, particularly grain, which required stable environments to remain usable across seasons. You can sense that logic everywhere around you. Stability is not luxury here, it is survival. You move toward a central grain processing area where activity is continuous. The sound of grinding stones forms a steady, layered rhythm that seems to define the entire space. The flour-like material produced here is exceptionally fine compared to earlier stages, indicating both improved tools and accumulated expertise passed through generations. Evidence from material culture research shows that a progressive refinement of grinding techniques played a major role in expanding the culinary possibilities of grain, allowing for smoother dough formation and more consistent cooking outcomes. You feel that refinement in the ease with which the material now responds to water and pressure. You watch as dough is prepared in large quantities. The process is no longer exploratory, it is procedural. Water is added in measured amounts, not through instruments, but through practiced intuition. The mixture is worked until it reaches a familiar elasticity that everyone in the area seems to recognize without discussion. Ethnographic analysis of traditional food systems suggests that sensory calibration often replaces formal measurement in early societies, with communities relying on shared tactile standards to maintain consistency. You can see that shared standard here, expressed entirely through touch and repetition. Nearby, elongated dough forms are being produced again, but now the process appears fully stabilized across multiple groups. The stretching motion is consistent, the thickness controlled, and the resulting shapes are arranged with deliberate order. There is no variation in intention anymore, only minor variation in execution. Research in experimental archaeology proposes that many early standardized food forms likely emerged through cumulative imitation of successful practices, gradually eliminating less efficient variations until dominant techniques remained. You are witnessing that elimination process reach a point of stability. You move deeper into the settlement and notice how food production has become embedded into the physical structure of space. Certain areas are permanently associated with specific tasks. Grinding happens in one zone, mixing in another, and heat transformation in another. These divisions are not formally marked, but they are universally understood. One anthropological perspective suggests that spatial organization in early human environments often emerges directly from habitual movement patterns, with repeated actions shaping functional geography over time. You're walking through that shaped geography now. You pause near a heating area where dough is being transformed through controlled exposure to heat. The process is carefully managed, with attention given to positioning and duration. The results vary slightly depending on placement, but the overall outcome is predictable and repeatable. Some food history interpretations suggest that controlled heating techniques may have developed incrementally from attempts to improve consistency in early grain preparations, with communities gradually refining methods through observation and adjustment. You can feel that gradual refinement in the precision of placement and timing. You continue towards the outer edges of cultivated land. The fields here extend further than in previous sections, forming broad, irregular expanses that still carry traces of wild growth. However, human influence is increasingly visible in plant distribution and density. Agricultural research often emphasizes that early cultivation was not a fixed system but a dynamic interaction between human selection and environmental response, gradually shaping plant populations over extended periods. You can sense that interaction in the uneven but intentional patterns of growth. The wind moves across the fields, carrying fine particles of grain dust and dry earth. It connects cultivated and uncultivated space in a continuous flow, blurring the boundary between human activity and natural processes. Nothing here is fully separate anymore. You return toward the settlement as light begins to shift. Activity continues but becomes less intense. Some groups focus on final preparation of grain for the day, while others manage storage or maintenance tasks. The rhythm remains consistent, but the energy softens. Historical interpretations of early settlement behavior suggest that daily life was often structured indirectly by food production cycles, with subsistence activities acting as the primary regulator of communal timing. You can feel that regulation in the natural slowing of movement around you. You sit again near a central preparation site. The sequence of transformation is now fully established. Grain is processed into fine material, mixed with water, kneaded into cohesive dough, shaped into standardized forms, and exposed to controlled heat. Each step flows into the next without uncertainty. Archaeological synthesis highlights that once food preparation reaches procedural stability, it becomes a foundational element of cultural continuity, shaping not only diet but also shared rhythm and collective memory across generations. You're now standing inside that continuity. You take a portion again. The texture is consistent and familiar, No longer requiring attention to understand, it has become part of expectation rather than discovery. That reliability carries its own quiet weight, a sense that something important has stabilized. The fire continues to burn as evening deepens. The settlement transitions into a lower activity state, but does not become inactive. Storage is checked, tools are organized, and food is prepared for future use. The system continues even in rest, and within that ongoing continuity, you begin to perceive something larger forming beneath all individual actions, not invention, not sudden change, but gradual accumulation, a shared human logic expressed through grain, shaping behavior across time and distance. Everything here is still in motion, but the direction of that motion is becoming unmistakably clear. You move forward again, and the sense of distance between communities begins to feel less important than the similarity of what they are doing, even without direct contact. You can sense parallel developments unfolding in multiple directions. The handling of grain, the shaping of dough, the control of heat. All of it appears in slightly different form, but with unmistakable shared logic. It is as if human necessity is writing the same solution in different places at once. Archaeological research broadly supports the idea that early agrarian societies developed convergent food practices, especially around staple grains, because similar environmental pressures tend to produce similar technological responses. You are now inside one of those convergences. The world around you is no longer fragmented experimentation. It is a widening pattern of shared adaptation. You enter a settlement that feels more structured in its flow of activity. Movement is smooth and continuous. With fewer interruptions, people navigate around each other with practiced ease, as though the layout of the space is understood without needing explicit instruction. The settlement feels less like a collection of individuals and more like a coordinated organism sustained by repetition. One interpretation in settlement archaeology suggests that increasing efficiency in daily tasks often precedes formal organization, as repeated behaviors gradually shape both social expectations and physical space. You can observe that process clearly here. Nothing is formally designed, yet everything feels arranged. You move toward a grain processing area where activity is constant. The grinding of stone tools produces a layered rhythm that is almost hypnotic in its repetition. The flour-like material being created is extremely fine and uniform, reflecting long-term refinement of technique and tool design. Material studies in early food systems indicate that finer grain processing significantly expanded the range of possible food textures and preparation methods, allowing for more complex dough behaviors and more consistent thermal transformation. You can feel that expanded possibility in the responsiveness of the material itself. You watch as dough is prepared with high consistency across multiple individuals. The mixture is no longer adjusted by guesswork alone. Instead, there is a shared understanding of texture that appears to be widely recognized. Water is added carefully, and the mixture is worked until it reaches a specific elasticity that everyone seems to know instinctively. Ethnographic observations of traditional culinary systems often highlight that shared sensory benchmarks emerge in communities over time, allowing consistency without formal measurement systems. You see that benchmark operating here in real time, expressed entirely through touch and repetition. Nearby, elongated dough forms are being created with remarkable uniformity. The stretching motion is smooth and controlled, and the resulting shapes are nearly identical in thickness. They are arranged in ordered groupings before being exposed to heat or drying conditions, suggesting a stable method rather than ongoing experimentation. Food history research frequently points out that many standardized food forms likely developed through gradual convergence of repeated successful techniques. Rather than from single moments of invention, you are witnessing that convergence solidify into routine practice. You move deeper into the settlement and notice that the organization of space is now more strongly defined. Certain zones are consistently associated with specific tasks, and this association is reinforced through repetition rather than formal planning. Grinding, mixing, shaping, and heating all occur in predictable areas. One anthropological model of early settlement development suggests that spatial order often emerges from accumulated behavior patterns, where repeated actions gradually define the structure of the environment. You are walking through an environment shaped by that accumulation. You pause near a heat application area where dough is being transformed under controlled conditions. The placement of items near heat sources is deliberate, and the resulting differences in texture are carefully observed. Some forms become firmer, others remain softer, depending on exposure and positioning. Experimental food archaeology suggests that early thermal techniques likely evolved through continuous adjustment, with communities refining heat application methods over long periods of trial and observation. You can sense that refinement in every controlled placement. You continue toward the outer cultivated areas. The fields are broader now, extending further into the landscape and showing clearer patterns of human influence. Plant density varies in ways that suggest selection and repeated cultivation. Some varieties dominate, while others recede. Agricultural anthropology often emphasizes that domestication is a gradual feedback process between human preference and environmental response, rather than a single transformative event. You can feel that feedback in the subtle shaping of the land around you. The wind passes through the fields, carrying dry particles of grain and soil. It creates a continuous connection between cultivated space and surrounding terrain. The boundary between managed and unmanaged land feels increasingly blurred, as both are now part of the same ecological system shaped by human activity. You return toward the settlement as the light softens. Activity continues but slows slightly. Some groups are finishing preparation cycles, while others focus on storage and maintenance. The rhythm of work remains steady, but the intensity fades with the approaching evening. Studies of early subsistence patterns suggest that daily life in agrarian societies often became indirectly synchronized with food production cycles, with grain processing serving as a temporal anchor for communal activity. You can feel that synchronization guiding movement and timing throughout the settlement. You sit again near a central preparation area. The full sequence is now entirely familiar. Grain is processed into fine material, mixed with water, kneaded into cohesive dough, shaped into consistent forms, and exposed to controlled heat or drying. Each stage flows into the next without hesitation or uncertainty. Archaeological synthesis often emphasizes that once food systems reach procedural stability, they become foundational to cultural continuity, influencing not only diet but also shared rhythm, memory, and social structure. You are now within that stabilized system. You take a portion again. The texture is fully predictable at this point. It no longer surprises you, but it does not feel diminished. Instead, it carries the weight of reliability, a sense that outcomes can be expected and repeated across time. The fire continues to burn into the evening. The settlement transitions into a quieter phase, but activity does not cease entirely. It becomes maintenance, preparation, and anticipation for the next cycle. Grain is stored, tools are arranged, and dough is prepared ahead of need. And within this continuous repetition, you begin to recognize something larger than individual actions, a shared human system of transformation, built not through sudden invention, but through countless repeated gestures refined over generations. Everything here is still moving forward, but the direction has become steady enough that it feels almost inevitable. You move forward again, and the world feels as though it has entered a deeper layer of continuity. The changes are no longer dramatic or even clearly visible at first glance. Instead, they are embedded in repetition itself. The more you observe, the more you realize that stability is not static. It is the result of countless small adjustments that have settled into rhythm over time. Archaeological synthesis of early agrarian societies often emphasizes that once grain-based subsistence became reliable, human activity began to reorganize itself around food production cycles rather than purely environmental unpredictability. You're now standing inside that reorganization. Time feels structured not by clocks or markers, but by preparation, transformation, and storage. You enter a settlement where activity feels highly synchronized, even without formal coordination. People move with anticipation of each other's actions. There is little hesitation in shared spaces. The environment feels shaped by familiarity rather than instruction. Everything flows in loops of repeated behavior. One line of anthropological reasoning suggests that as subsistence systems stabilize, social coordination naturally increases because shared survival tasks require implicit timing alignment. You can feel that alignment here, expressed through movement rather than language. You approach a central grain processing area where the density of activity is noticeably higher than in earlier sections. Multiple grinding stations operate simultaneously, producing a continuous stream of finely processed grain material. The sound is layered but rhythmic, almost like a collective pulse embedded in the settlement. Material studies in early food production indicate that finer and more consistent grain processing allowed for greater control over dough behavior, which in turn expanded the range of possible preparation methods. You can sense that control in the predictability of the mixture being handled. You observe dough being prepared with remarkable uniformity across different individuals. The process appears fully internalized. Water is added gradually, and the mixture is worked until it reaches a shared tactile standard. There is no visible discussion, yet outcomes are consistent. Ethnographic research into traditional food systems highlights that sensory calibration often becomes a communal skill over time, allowing groups to maintain consistency without formalized instruction or measurement tools. You see that calibration operating seamlessly here. Nearby, elongated dough forms are being shaped again, but now with near complete standardization. The stretching motion is fluid and efficient. The resulting strands are uniform in thickness and length, suggesting that the technique has reached a stable form of practice across the community. Food history analysis often points out that standardization in early culinary forms tends to emerge through repetition of successful methods rather than centralized planning, gradually narrowing variation as efficiency becomes prioritized. You are witnessing that narrowing reach maturity. You move through the settlement and notice that spatial organization has become more pronounced. Certain areas are consistently used for specific tasks, and these zones feel reinforced through repeated behavior rather than formal boundaries. The settlement is effectively structured by habit. One perspective in settlement archaeology suggests us that repeated daily activity can gradually shape the spatial logic of communities, turning functional repetition into de facto architectural order. You're walking through that emergent order now. You pause near a heating area where dough is undergoing transformation. Heat application is carefully managed, with attention to placement and timing. The results vary slightly depending on positioning, but the overall method is consistent and predictable. Experimental archaeology studies propose that controlled cooking techniques likely evolved through iterative refinement, as early communities adjusted exposure to heat to improve texture, preservation, and reliability. You can feel that refinement embedded in the precision of placement. You continue towards the outer cultivated region. The fields extend broadly now, forming an expansive patchwork of human-influenced growth. Plant distribution shows subtle signs of selection, with certain grain types appearing more dominant and widespread. Agricultural research commonly describes domestication as a long-term co-evolutionary process between human preference and plant adaptation, shaped through repeated cycles of cultivation and harvest. You are witnessing that co-evolution in physical form. The wind moves across the fields, carrying fine traces of dry grain and soil, It links cultivated and uncultivated zones into a continuous ecological field influenced by human activity. The distinction between natural and managed space continues to blur. You return toward the settlement as daylight begins to soften. Activity slows slightly, though it does not cease. Some groups complete final processing tasks, while others focus on storage and preparation for future cycles. The rhythm remains steady but less intense. Research into early agrarian behavior suggests that daily activity patterns often became indirectly structured by food processing cycles, effectively turning subsistence tasks into a shared temporal framework for communities. You can feel that framework shaping movement and pacing. You sit again near the central preparation area. The full sequence of grain transformation is now entirely familiar, milling into fine material, mixing with water, kneading into cohesive dough, shaping into standardized forms, and applying controlled heat or drying. Each stage flows naturally into the next. Historical interpretation in food systems research often emphasizes that once procedural consistency is achieved, it becomes a foundation for cultural continuity, allowing practices to persist across generations with minimal deviation. You are now within that continuity. You take a portion again. The texture is stable and predictable. It no longer draws attention through novelty, but through reliability. That reliability has become its own form of meaning. The fire continues into evening. The settlement transitions into a quieter phase, but activity remains present in the background. Storage is checked, tools are arranged, and preparation for future cycles continues without interruption. And within this steady repetition, you begin to recognize that something far larger is forming beneath everyday actions. A shared behavioral system built not on invention, but on accumulated repetition refined across generations. Everything is still moving, but now it is moving with direction that feels increasingly established. You move forward again, and the landscape begins to feel as though it has entered a phase of quiet consolidation. The experimentation you saw in earlier sections has not disappeared, but it has been absorbed into a more stable framework of daily life. Variation still exists, yet it now operates within boundaries that feel increasingly shared across communities. Grain remains the core material, but its handling has become more predictable, more refined, and more deeply embedded in routine. Archaeological interpretations of late Neolithic and early Bronze Age agrarian systems often emphasize that once staple crops become reliable, societies begin to reorganize labor, storage, and seasonal planning around them with increasing precision. You are now walking through that reorganization at its most grounded level, where food is not only produced but structurally woven into how time and space are experienced. You enter a settlement that feels noticeably more settled than earlier Uyisa ones. The arrangement of activity zones is clearer, and movement through space feels smoother, as if repeated use has polished the environment into functional clarity. Paths are consistently used, storage areas are more robust, and communal spaces for grain processing appear central to daily life. One interpretive framework in settlement archaeology suggests that increasing spatial clarity in early communities often emerges from accumulated behavioral repetition rather than intentional design, with daily practices gradually defining the structure of lived space. You can feel that process here in every repeated motion. You move toward the central grain processing area, where activity is steady and continuous. The sound of grinding stones forms a persistent background rhythm, layered with the softer sounds of mixing and preparation. The grain being processed is now extremely fine, producing a consistent flour-like substance that behaves predictably when combined with water. Material studies in early food production indicate that finer grain processing significantly improved the versatility of dough-based foods, enabling more controlled shaping and more reliable cooking outcomes. You can sense that improvement in how effortlessly the material now binds and stretches under pressure. You observe dough preparation across multiple individuals working in parallel. The process is highly consistent. Water is added in controlled amounts, and the mixture is worked until it reaches a shared tactile standard. There is no visible instruction being given, yet outcomes remain remarkably uniform. Ethnographic studies of traditional subsistence cultures suggest that shared sensory calibration often replaces explicit instruction over time, with communities developing collective understanding of texture and readiness through repeated exposure. You see that shared calibration operating seamlessly in every motion around you. Nearby, elongated dough forms are being produced with striking consistency. The stretching process is smooth and controlled, and the resulting shapes are nearly identical in thickness and length. They are arranged in orderly groupings before undergoing further transformation through heat or drying processes. Food history research often points out that standardization in early culinary forms typically emerges through long-term imitation of effective practices, gradually eliminating variation as efficiency and reliability become prioritized. You are witnessing that process reach a mature and stable stage. You move deeper into the settlement and notice that spatial organization has become increasingly reinforced. Specific areas are consistently associated with particular stages of food preparation. These associations are maintained through repetition rather than formal designation, yet they are universally understood by those within the community. One line of anthropological thought suggests that spatial order in early settlements often arises from habitual movement patterns, where repeated activity gradually defines functional geography. You are walking through a landscape shaped almost entirely by repetition. You pause near a heating area where dough is being transformed under controlled conditions. Heat application is carefully managed, with attention to placement, distance, and timing. The resulting differences in texture are subtle but meaningful, and they are clearly recognized by those working with the material. Experimental food archaeology suggests that controlled heating techniques likely develop through incremental adjustments aimed at improving consistency and preservation. With early communities refining methods through continuous observation, you can sense that refinement in the precision of each placement. You continue towards the outer cultivated zones. The fields extend widely now, forming a large and irregular but increasingly managed landscape. Plant distribution shows signs of long-term selection, with certain grain varieties becoming more dominant over time due to repeated human preference. Agricultural anthropology commonly describes domestication as a gradual co-evolutionary process between human behavior and plant response, shaped through continuous cycles of cultivation and harvest. You can see that coevolution expressed in the structure of the land itself. The wind moves across the fields, carrying fine particles of grain and dry soil. It creates a continuous connection between cultivated and uncultivated space, blending them into a single ecological system increasingly influenced by human activity. You return toward the settlement as light begins to soften. Activity continues but at a reduced intensity. Some groups complete final preparation tasks, while others focus on storage management and maintenance. The rhythm remains steady, though less energetic than earlier in the day. Research into early agrarian systems suggests that daily life often became indirectly organized around food production cycles, with grain processing acting as a central temporal reference for communal activity. You can feel that structuring influence shaping the entire settlement. You sit again near the central preparation area. The sequence of transformation is now fully stabilized and familiar grain is milled into fine material, mixed with water, kneaded into cohesive dough, shaped into standardized forms, and exposed to controlled heat or drying. Each stage flows naturally into the next without hesitation. Historical synthesis in food systems research often emphasizes that once procedural stability is achieved, it becomes a foundation for long-term cultural continuity, allowing practices to persist across generations with minimal alteration. You are now within that stabilized continuity. You take a portion again, The texture is fully predictable and consistent. It no longer draws attention through novelty, but through reliability and familiarity. That consistency carries its own meaning, representing a quiet mastery over uncertainty. The fire continues burning into evening. The settlement transitions into a lower activity phase, but does not become inactive. Storage is checked, tools are arranged, and preparation for future cycles continues in the background. The system remains in motion, even as rest begins. And within this ongoing continuity, you begin to recognize that something far larger is taking shape beneath individual actions, not a single invention or breakthrough, but an accumulation of repeated behavior refined over generations into a shared human system of transformation. Everything here is still moving, but it is moving along a path that now feels increasingly established and difficult to reverse. You move forward again, and something changes in how the entire landscape feels around you. It is no longer presenting itself as a series of developments or stages. Instead, everything appears layered at once, as if earlier patterns of human behavior have not disappeared, but continue to exist underneath later refinements. Grain remains at the center of it all, yet it no longer feels like a simple food source. It feels like a persistent structure that has shaped human existence across generations. Long-duration archaeological perspective suggests that once staple crops reach full integration into human societies, they stop being merely agricultural products and instead become organizing principles for settlement, economy, and daily life. You're now standing within that full integration. Nothing here is separate anymore. Everything connects back to the same quiet cycle of transformation. You enter a settlement that feels deeply settled. Not in the sense of being static, but in the sense of being fully adapted. The rhythm of activity is steady and predictable. People move through their tasks with ease, not because the work is simple, but because it has been repeated so many times that it no longer requires conscious adjustment. The environment itself seems to support the flow of activity. One broad interpretation in settlement archaeology suggests that when subsistence systems stabilize over long periods, they begin to shape not only physical space but also perception of time, creating rhythms that govern daily life more strongly than external environmental variation. You can feel that rhythm here, embedded in every movement. You approach the central processing area, where grain is still being transformed in the same fundamental sequence you have seen throughout this journey. The scale is larger now, but the process remains consistent. Grinding produces a fine, uniform material. Mixing with water creates a cohesive dough. Shaping produces stable, repeatable forms. Heat transforms them into something more durable and usable. Material culture studies indicate that this kind of procedural stability is one of the most important foundations for long-term societal continuity, because it allows knowledge to be transmitted without loss across generations. You are witnessing that transmission not as an abstract idea, but as a physical reality happening in real time. You observe that the people working here no longer appear to be experimenting with the process. Instead, they are maintaining it. Small adjustments still occur, but they are refinements within a known system rather than explorations of unknown possibilities. The uncertainty that defined earlier stages has been replaced by continuity. Ethnographic research into traditional food systems suggests that once a culinary practice becomes fully embedded in daily life, it transitions from innovation to identity, meaning it is no longer just something people do, but something that defines how they understand their relationship to time, effort, and survival. You can feel that transition clearly in the atmosphere. Nearby, elongated forms of dough are still being shaped, but now the process feels entirely standardized. The stretching, cutting, and arranging follow patterns that are consistent across individuals and groups. These forms are no longer experimental variations, they are established outcomes of a stable system. Food history research often notes that when culinary forms achieve long-term stability, They begin to carry cultural memory even when their origins are no longer consciously remembered. You're now seeing that kind of stabilized memory embedded in daily repetition. You move deeper into the settlement, where spatial organization feels almost invisible in its efficiency. There are no formal divisions in the modern sense, yet every area is clearly defined by the repeated use. The structure of the settlement is maintained not by design, but by accumulated behavior that has solidified over time. One theoretical approach in environmental archaeology suggests that human landscapes in early agrarian societies are best understood as living records of repeated activity, where space is continuously rewritten by habitual motion. You're walking through that living record now. You pause near a heat processing area where grain-based preparations are being transformed under controlled conditions. The differences in placement and timing are subtle, but they are intentional within the established system. Outcomes are consistent, and deviations are quickly corrected through shared understanding. Experimental reconstructions of early cooking systems suggest that controlled thermal processing likely emerged from gradual refinement of simple exposure techniques, eventually producing reliable methods for transforming grain into stable food, forms suitable for storage and transport. You can sense that long refinement in the precision of every action. You continue toward the outer cultivated land. The fields stretch widely, forming a vast agricultural environment shaped by long-term human influence. Grain distribution patterns reflect centuries of selection, adaptation, and environmental interaction. Some varieties dominate, while others fade into the background of cultivation history. Agricultural science perspectives emphasize that domestication is not a single event but an ongoing process of co-evolution between human practices and plant responses, continuously shaped by cycles of cultivation and selection. You are now inside the outcome of that long process. The wind moves across the fields, carrying fine dust and organic particles. It connects cultivated and uncultivated areas into a single ecological system where human influence is now inseparable from natural processes. The boundary that once felt distinct has become fluid and gradual. You return toward the settlement as evening settles in. Activity continues but shifts in tone. The intensity of labor decreases, replaced by maintenance and preparation. Some groups manage storage, others prepare materials for future use, and others complete final processing tasks. Anthropological reconstructions of agrarian life suggest that in stable agricultural societies, daily rhythms become indirectly organized around staple food production, creating a temporal structure that guides behavior across entire communities. You can feel that structure shaping everything around you. You sit once more near the central preparation area. The full transformation cycle is now entirely familiar. Grain becomes fine material through grinding. It is combined with water to form dough. It is shaped into consistent forms, and it is transformed through controlled heat or drying. Each stage flows naturally into the next without disruption. Food systems analysis broadly agrees that once such procedural cycles stabilize, they become foundational to cultural continuity, allowing practices to persist across generations while still adapting gradually to new conditions. You are now fully within that continuity, where repetition itself becomes the mechanism of preservation. You take a portion again. The texture is predictable, stable, and familiar. It no longer represents discovery, but reliability. That reliability carries meaning not because it is new, but because it can be repeated indefinitely without loss of identity. The fire continues to burn as night deepens. The settlement transitions into a quieter phase, but does not fully stop. It shifts into preparation for the next cycle, ensuring that grain, tools, and dough are ready for continued use. Even rest is part of the system. And within this ongoing repetition, you begin to understand that what you have been witnessing is not just the origin of a food, but the formation of a long human logic of transformation. a system built not from invention, but from accumulated repetition so consistent that it becomes invisible. Grain is still grain here, but everything it touches has become structure, memory and continuity. And as the fire burns steadily into the night, the story does not end, it simply continues, carried forward by every hand that repeats the same motion again and again, across time that stretches far beyond this moment. Sweet dreams.